Chapter 1 Checkmark. Sarah Corrigan's father was never a truly bad man. He had his poor qualities, a heavy gambling habit and a blind spot for the consequences of his actions being the most obvious, but he was not cruel or unkind. Sarah had to remind herself of this every time she arrived at her job as a secretary for an extremely shady company that was formerly owned by Wilson Fisk himself. Her father had not meant to get her stuck in these circumstances, she repeated to herself. He had no control over the situation. All the same, as she looked up at the looming gray building that was home to Orient Incorporated, she felt a familiar feeling of resentment rise up in her, and had to force herself to swallow it back down. Sarah couldn't believe she was back here at 10 o'clock at night, a full 5 hours after she had already been free for the day. She had forgotten to take home some dull paperwork that she had needed to fill out, and she had learned from the past 5 months of working there, mistakes were not tolerated by the management, specifically by her overbearing supervisor, Ronan. Ronan had wandering eyes and occasionally wandering hands, and he took every opportunity to attempt to intimidate Sarah by threatening to tell the higher-ups she wasn't working hard enough to keep her into the agreement. She was keen to avoid drawing more criticism to herself, so she had reluctantly gotten back on the subway and ridden across town to get the paperwork from the darkened building and bring it home. She keyed her employee code into the security panel beside the front door and entered the building. Since Fisk had been taken down by Daredevil, his mysterious replacement at the head of the company had installed several new security measures, including new codes and new cameras. Sarah carefully avoided looking at what as she walked to the front desk that was usually manned during the day. As a general rule, she refused to think about her job, if you could call it that, when she wasn't at work, and right now she technically wasn't on the clock. She briefly considered taking the stairs. The paperwork had needed was in the conference room on the 3rd floor, but the clientele that frequented the building had an unfortunate habit of smoking on the stairwells, leaving them smelling like cigarettes and body odor. So she opted for the elevator instead. As the elevator rose, Sarah thought she could hear muffled noises coming from above her. The sounds got louder as she got closer to the 3rd floor, and as the lift came to a stop, she could clearly hear shouting and crashing from the other side of the doors. The elevator doors slid open, and the first thing Sarah saw was a 6'4" Russian flying towards her. She jumped to the side as the man crashed into the open elevator, crumpling into a heap on the threshold. Behind him, chaos raged. Ronan and 4 men that Sarah loosely recognized as other employees were in various stages of fighting, and apparently losing to a masked man dressed in black. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized the subject of every Hell's Kitchen news outlet for the past few months. Daredevil. The vigilante was struggling with three of the men, while a bleeding Ronan leaned against the wall, gasping for breath and clutching his right arm, which apparently had to be broken. Another man appeared to already be unconscious, sprawled out on the floor near the conference table, in the middle of the room. Daredevil moved impressively fast, thrashing one of the men with effectively blocking the other 2. Sarah slammed her hand onto the down button, intending to get out of the fray, but the man whom she assumed Daredevil had thrown her way was blocking the doors from closing. He didn't wake as the doors bumped persistently against his side. Shit! She bent down to try and heave the giant form out of the way, but within a few seconds of trying, she could tell he was far too heavy. Suddenly she heard a gunshot, and the water cooler that sat a mere few feet from the elevator door exploded, flooding the floor with water and broken glass. Snapping her head up, she saw Ronan, stupid asshole Ronan, firing a handgun. He was apparently aiming at the vigilante, but with his dominant arm clearly broken, he was forced to fire with his left hand, and the bullets were going everywhere. Scrambling from the colossal Russian, who shockingly appeared to be steering, Sarah ducked low and ran along the wall closest to her, keeping away from the raging fight and hopefully the flying bullets. Something smashed in the wall close above her head, and she screamed. The vigilante's head snapped in her direction, and in his moment of distraction, one of the men slashed his face with what looked like a shard of glass. Daredevil hissed in pain and slammed his fist into the man's face, focused once more on the fight. The stairwell was on the other side of the fray. There was no way she'd make it over there in one piece. Instead, Sarah dipped into the first room she came to, a small, darkened office. She scanned the room, looking for a place to hide. Unfortunately, her best bet seemed to be underneath the desk in the far corner, an obvious hiding place, but it would conceal her at least. Crawling into the small space, she fumbled in her purse with a stun gun. She wasn't sure who she was more scared of, the vigilante that was currently taking on 4 fully grown men, having already taken out 2 more, or the idiot with a gun and no aim. A stun gun probably wouldn't do much against either of them, but it was better than nothing, she supposed. She listened as the fighting continued. The gunshots ceased suddenly, and she heard Ronan shout in pain. The loud blows and various grunts continued for several minutes, and she could hear the men drop, one by one. Finally there was silence, except for the one man groaning lowly in pain. She could hear Daredevil speaking to him quietly, and strained her ears to hear what he was saying. "Who took over for Fisk?" The man mumbled something. She couldn't make it out completely, but it sounded vulgar. There was a loud snapping sound, and he screeched in pain. It sounded like the vigilante was breaking the man's fingers. Sarah winced. "I'll ask again. Who took over for Fisk?" "I don't know." Another snap, followed by another scream. "I don't know. I don't know. They don't tell me. They don't tell anyone everything. We all got little pieces of the puzzle." The vigilante growled in frustration. "There's a list of employees of this company. Where is it?" On a drive, in the cabinet, over there. But it won't help you. No one knows nothing." There was a silence, and then a dull thud as she assumed Daredevil knocked the man out. She heard him moving around the other room, presumably to find whatever list the now unconscious man had mentioned. Sarah held her breath, hoping he would go down the staircase and away from her, but she had no such luck. Daredevil limped slowly into the office, and then stopped. Sarah could see him through a small opening between the top of the desk and the side. He was standing in the middle of the room with his head down, his shoulders heaving as he breathed heavily. The moonlight through the window illuminated the uncovered lower half of his face, and Sarah could see a gash on his face. It was long and shaped like a check mark, going down along his jaw and then running over his bottom lip. Blood dripped from the cut as he stood there, not moving. What was he doing? Then he turned his head in her direction, and Sarah's stomach flipped. She couldn't see his eyes through the mask, but it looked like he was staring right at her hiding place. "Don't come looking for me. Please, don't come looking for me." She gripped her stun gun tighter, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. She had no way of knowing, of course, that he could hear her rocketing heartbeat clear as day. That the scent of her shampoo and perfume was like a beacon, telling him exactly where she was hiding. That he could sense the electric current in the stun gun she had in her hand, and feel the vibrations in the air from her slight trembling. That he could also tell she wasn't injured, hadn't been hit by the bullets or the debris. After what seemed like a century of him seemingly staring directly at her, he limped over to the window, slid it open, and heaved himself out. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief. Either he hadn't known she was there, or he thought she wasn't worth the effort. She heard police sirens approaching. The gunshots must have attracted attention. Crawling out from under the desk, she wondered briefly how Daredevil could survive casually jumping out of a third-story window. She wasn't sure if the vigilante would have hurt her or not. She worked for the worst people in Hell's Kitchen, but rumors seemed divided on how much violence he generally inflicted to get what he wanted. Regardless, she was relieved to never have to see him again. Unfortunately, that sense of relief would only last for the 18 hours it took her to run into him again. The next day, news of the vigilante's attack had spread around the company. Sarah spent most of the day fiddling phone calls and making appointments for many more clients than usual, all of whom were anxious to come in and make sure their status in the criminal hierarchy of Hell's Kitchen was still secure. By the end of the day, her head was pounding from having to deal with so many of the city's lowest criminals. She counted down the minutes until she could leave, comforting herself with the thought that at least it was Tuesday and she had her weekly dinner with her father tonight. The clock finally reached the magic hour, and she swung her purse over her shoulder and made her way to Ronan's office to settle the day's finances. His beady eyes were actually watching her as she entered his office. Wordlessly, she handed him her timesheet, and he stared at her for an extra beat before turning his gaze to the paper. Alright, that's 10 hours for today, minus half an hour for lunch, and another 10 minutes for goofing off at the end of your shift, packing up your things. Sarah bristled, but didn't say anything. There was no point in arguing for something as small as 10 minutes. He looked disappointed that he didn't get a rise out of her. So that brings you to 9 hours and 20 minutes. That's 4 hours and 35 minutes off your paycheck. And the other half for Daddy Dearest debt. He smiled at her mockingly. At this rate, you'll be done working this off in less than 10 years. The subway ride to her apartment was long and tiring, as it always felt during a long day of forcing smiles for horrible people. Sarah had time to take a quick shower and change clothes, and then it was time to catch a cab over to her father's place. She made a mental note that she needed to stop at the pharmacy for his medication on the way over, and that she needed to call and set up his usual doctor's appointment for the upcoming month. As she exited the building and heard someone calling her name, turning, she saw her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Benedict, walking towards her. She was accompanied by a handsome man in a suit. He wore dark, round sunglasses and swept the trademark white cane of the blind man in front of him as he walked, limping slightly. "Sarah! Are you headed toward your father's place? I need to go that way to get some groceries. Do you feel like sharing a cab with an old woman?" "I don't know if you're allowed to call yourself old yet, Mrs. Benedict," Sarah replied doubtfully. "I saw you chase that kid down the street the other day for trying to steal your purse, and then you started beating him with it," Mrs. Benedict cackled. "That dumb lout didn't know what hit him," Sarah laughed, then leaned in to the front window of the cab to give the address to the driver while Mrs. Benedict said goodbye to the blind man accompanying her. Sarah faced him again, just as the man turned to walk away, and for the first time she got a good look at the left side of his face, specifically a very recent-looking gash running along his jaw and up onto his bottom lip in the shape of a check mark. Sarah froze. There was no way it was possible. But he had the same exact cut in the same place, the same limp in the same leg. She felt like the breath had been knocked out of her. There was no denying the man standing in front of her was the same one that had torn his way through the office the night before. He seemed not to notice her reaction, although she could have sworn he saw him pause for just a second and tilt his head slightly in her direction before continuing on his way. "Are you getting in or getting out, kid?" she heard Mrs. Benedict say from inside the taxi, although she sounded much farther away. Sarah ducked into the vehicle, still in shock, and turned to her neighbor as they pulled away. "Mrs. Benedict? Who was that?" "Oh, that's Matthew Murdoch. He's a very sweet lawyer. He's helped me with all the trouble I've been having with those dumbasses at the department store." "Why do you ask?" "He's a very attractive young man, isn't he?" Mrs. Benedict asked knowingly. Yeah, definitely," she said distractedly, not paying much attention to the older woman's usual attempts to set her up with any man that could walk and breathe. That was Pretty nasty cut on his face, though. Did he mention how he got it? Sarah asked with forced casualness. Yes, poor thing. He said he tried taking the subway and stumbled getting out of the door. You know, they really should make those things safer. Just the other day, my friend Georgina, you remember Georgina? Of course, was trying to get out. Sarah tuned Mrs. Benedict's rambling out as her mind raced with the new information. Lost in her thoughts, she felt the old woman press something into her hand and glanced down. It was a business card. It bore the words, Nelson and Murdoch, attorneys at law, followed by a phone number with local Hell's Kitchen area code. He's very smart, you know, and funny too. I think you'd like him. And it's been so long since you've been out with anyone. He came all this way just to take my statements since I couldn't make it to his office. I had no idea when we spoke on the phone that he's blind. Mrs. Benedict whispered the last part in a way that the older people always whisper, very unpleasant, as though his blindness was secret that Sarah was and the rest of the world couldn't see as plain as day. No, his blindness was obvious for all to see. His nighttime activity, on the other hand. Sarah felt a cold stone of trepidation drop onto her stomach. She was pretty sure not many people knew about that part.